Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Live Impact News. I'm Vanessa Rufus. Right off the bat, we want to start with a live feed that's coming in as we speak right now. It looks like D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser is hosting a virtual town hall. Of course, this coming on the heels of the Trump administration announcement that it is deploying National Guard and federalizing Metropolitan Police. Let's listen in right now to hear the conversation.
Out our challenges, we take care of our own business and we take care of our own people. So I think sharing your DC story, whether it's on your social media, with colleagues, is important. That we're telling people we don't live in a dirty city. We are not 700,000 scumbags and punks, and we don't have neighborhoods that should be bulldozed. So like we have to be clear about our story, who we are, and what we want for our city. So please get out there and share and reach out to us with any information, any concerns and recommendations like we've heard today. And so I just want to kind of be clear with everybody that I have a very my jobs are many right now, and part of it is just practically managing us through this crisis. But I'm also really ticked off about the intrusion on the district's autonomy and the characterization of the good work that we do in this city to make it beautiful, to have excellent services, to attract millions of tourists, to have a growing school system, to have a growing city with new residents showing up every day. So that's the real Washington, and I'm counting on you to make sure the world knows that as well. All right. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. If you have additional questions, feel free to email us at elm@dc.gov. Thank you very much.
All right, folks, so there you have it. That looked like that was the tail end there of that virtual town hall with D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser and other officials. As you heard there, the mayor saying she was, quote, her words, ticked off about the Trump administration deployment of National Guards into D.C. and the federalization of the Metropolitan Police. We've been following the latest with this story for the past couple of days now. A couple of developments of note since the last time we checked in. Looks like we are seeing even more rhetoric from the president regarding unhoused folks and where they might go or what could happen to them if they do not leave the city, because ultimately we saw over the weekend the president taking to social media urging unhoused folks in D.C. to, quote, telling them to move out immediately, saying, quote, we will give you places to stay that are far from the nation's capital. Well, then we had the announcement Monday talking about the federalization of the police department, the deployment of the National Guard. He talked about how the federal government would be removing encampments for the unhoused folks there from all over the parks. And so he reiterated again today, we saw the White House talking about how that would be a priority for them, not providing many details on exactly how the relocation would work, but essentially suggesting that displaced, unhoused folks use existing services that are available to them or face fines or jail time. Now, we've also been seeing discussions underway about crime in D.C. And so we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. We'll have a discussion with one of our colleagues at our sister station there in D.C. in just a few moments. But speaking of the White House, we did have Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt addressing some of those questions today regarding D.C. and other big topics. So let's listen into that earlier briefing. And once again, on the other side, we do hope to bring a live report from one of our colleagues there in D.C. reporting on the situation.
Everybody, good to see all of you here again today. On Friday morning, President Trump will travel across the country to Anchorage, Alaska for a bilateral meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The brutal war between Russia and Ukraine broke out under Joe Biden's incompetent leadership, but President Trump is determined to try and end this war and stop the killing. As the president has said over and over again, his strong preference will always be for peace and partnership, whenever those outcomes can possibly be achieved. There is no leader in the world right now who has been more committed to preventing wars or ending them than President Donald Trump. Just look at what took place here at the White House last Friday, when President Trump hosted the Azerbaijani president and Armenian prime minister and got the two leaders to sign a historic joint declaration for peace, ending a decades-long conflict that disrupted the region and claimed countless lives. In other news, we continue to see positive economic reports across the board. Today's CPI report revealed that inflation beat market expectations once again, and inflation remains stable. Overall, inflation has risen.
Okay, we'll get back to this briefing from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt in just a few moments. As we mentioned, one of the topics she discussed what is going on in D.C. and the deployment of the National Guard, among other measures on behalf of the Trump administration. Want to join now with our colleague Lorenzo Hall, who is there in D.C. and you and your colleagues in D.C. You've been reporting on not only announcement yesterday from the president, but everything that has entailed since. And I guess if you could catch us up to speed with the very latest, because from what I understand today, it sounds like the D.C. mayor has met with, it sounds like Pam Bondi, among other federal officials. And we just had a few moments ago here on the feed a virtual town hall that the mayor was hosting alongside other officials, talking about what they'd like folks to do to, I guess, essentially raise their voices if they feel like they are against this move.
Yeah, Vanessa, so essentially today you have a lot of folks trying to figure out exactly how this is going to work. We heard the president talking yesterday, talking about the violence in D.C. and how this is a lawless city and crime is just out of control. And today, a lot of folks were trying to wrap their brains around what he's talking about and what this is supposed to look like, because there's no real crisis in D.C. Typically, if you have some major event, if you have a lot of riots like we saw back on January 6th and also the Black Lives Matter protests following the death of George Floyd, of course you'd expect some sort of intervention from the federal government. But in this case, because we don't have that, we're not seeing that right now, a lot of folks are wondering, okay, what does this look like exactly? As you mentioned, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, she held a town hall, if you will, a community conversation session online, just letting people know what to expect, talking about some of her conversations with U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi there. And I can tell you that for the most part, it's almost like business as usual. We heard the president yesterday, but today we know that Pam Bondi will oversee the D.C. Police Department, but the structure is still in place. We still have our police chief who is overseeing the police department. She still makes all the decisions, but at this point they're just coordinating with the federal government to figure out where some of those hundreds of officers should be placed. And also you have the National Guard. We saw some of them arriving today at the Armory, but they haven't been dispatched to the city as of yet, so we're just standing by for that.
Yeah, I mean, if I could talk about some of the rhetoric that has been used regarding the crime in D.C., you know, you included one phrase that we've heard from the president, quote, lawless city. We saw today the U.S. Attorney for D.C., Jeanine Pirro, she had a briefing where she talked about, in part, homicides that had happened in D.C., and there were pictures of people that they rolled out on a poster board. I guess, what do the numbers say? And I guess, how do folks in D.C. feel about the crime, in the sense, do people in D.C. feel like there is a big crime issue?
Yeah, so, you know, Vanessa, as a journalist, you have to talk about both sides. You try to cover every angle. And it was a bit jarring to listen to the president and members of his cabinet talk about D.C. yesterday, knowing that that's not entirely what we're seeing with our own eyes. I think everyone will absolutely admit that, you know, crime is a problem in D.C. Out of control, lawless? Absolutely not. But it's like any other major city. You're going to experience crime. We know that 2023, as restrictions were sort of loosened after the pandemic, it was a tough year in the district. Carjackings, robberies, especially when it comes to children and teens. So yes, it can be a problem, but it's not to the point that what you heard the president mentioning there, being out of control. So I think a lot of people here are just sort of baffled at this point, trying to figure out why now. And yes, they'll tell you they need to get this under control. They believe that the DC Police Department needs more officers. They currently have about 3,200 officers. That may sound like a lot to you, but they also help with federal events as well. So that's why you need a police force of that size. So they'll say, yes, we need to get this under control, but the way the president is doing it in this case, no. We've had these conversations over and over again, especially when you talk about the root causes of crime. When you're talking about gun violence, you know, a lot of people are hungry. A lot of people are out of work. You're talking about layoffs, especially when you look at the federal government and what's happening there. $1.1 billion was pulled from the district's government by Congress. So when you really want to address this issue authentically, that's where you go, not just put a bunch of officers on the streets, because as we've seen before, that doesn't necessarily work.
How would you characterize the response from the mayor there in D.C.? And I guess I asked that in the question, you know, in the context of thinking about what we saw with Los Angeles and the deployment of National Guard there, and it got really heated. You know, the governor, Gavin Newsom, I mean, I felt like that escalated, and the mayor there, Karen Bass, I mean, she was very assertive in all of the press briefings we saw after, you know, the deployment happened for weeks on end. And I feel like, you know, what we've seen from the DC mayor feels like, I don't know. I mean, I guess she kind of
Very
indicated
measured.
her hands.
It's
Yeah, very measured. Yeah. How would you characterize it?
Yeah, we noticed listening to the president's remarks yesterday, he didn't mention the mayor once. And you know, when the president has an issue with someone, he will go after them, he will call them names, he will target them, but he did not mention Mayor Bowser because they've had a cordial relationship during his second term. So they've been working hand in hand. She has, this is quite the balance, because DC is known for being a Democratic city, and you're working with a Republican president. So she's been striking that balance, and you saw that play out as well during her press conference earlier today, and also yesterday after the president spoke. So she says she agrees with him on some things. They need to get, you know, she wants to get crime under control. She wants the support of the federal government. So she's trying to work with the president in that regard. In terms of homelessness, which is another thing the president mentioned. I don't know if your viewers will understand this entirely, but parts of DC, it's controlled by our local government, and then you have parts of the city controlled by the federal government. So for instance, if there's an incident on the National Mall, that would require the response from U.S. Park Police or some other federal agency. So they really do have to work hand in hand to get this done. So we're used to this working relationship and seeing it play out. So this is essentially what we're seeing play out today.
I'm curious to know, have you found any sort of historical precedent for something like this in DC? I imagine y'all probably are interested in looking back to see, you know, how close is this to maybe something that has happened in the past, if at all?
So I can tell you, so home rule gives DC this limited self-governance. So we can vote for a mayor, we can vote for city council, but we don't have voting representation in Congress. We can vote in the presidential election. We have roughly 3 delegates for that. So home rule is set up in a way that the feds still control DC. It was passed by Richard Nixon back in 1973. And Section 740, it gives the president emergency control of the DC Police Department. And we know this was set up because back then, President Nixon didn't believe that the DC government could get violence under control. So he had this put in there, so if anything happened, we know there were riots because of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. You had the Vietnam War back then as well. You had the heroin epidemic, and Nixon wanted to look tough on crime. So it wouldn't be a good look if you had the capital city near the White House just out of control. So he wanted to make sure he could still put his hand on the lever to get this in place, control the DC Police Department if he needed. And it's just been sitting there since Section 740. A lot of people haven't talked about it till now. So this is the first time we're seeing this play out. This is the first time a president has used this power under DC's Home Rule Act.
I am kind of curious to see, you know, whether this is re-sparking any sort of dialogue about, you know, the voting power or, you know, representation in DC, just because I know every time I go to DC, I see the license plates that talk about taxation without representation. And we've heard the mayor there saying essentially her hands are tied in a lot of ways, as you kind of alluded to. So is this sparking a larger discussion about maybe changes? I'm just curious about that.
Not yet. Not yet, because there's always that conversation, the push for statehood, as we call it, to give DC, to allow DC to govern itself without this interference from the federal government. For instance, they have to approve a budget. They have to sign off on local laws. So these are people that district residents haven't even voted for. But the problem here, Vanessa, is you have these lawmakers in Congress. Republicans control it right now, and there's no way they're going to let statehood pass. So for the moment, I think that conversation has been dialed back just a bit. But the mayor and other local leaders are making it a point to say, you know, this is why we've been talking about statehood all this time. Make note of what you see happening today. So when this conversation does come up again, when perhaps Democrats do have the majority in Congress and the presidency, they can use this as an example to push for statehood once again.
Yeah, really interesting situation. I'm curious to know what comes next here. You know, as a journalist, what are you watching for? Obviously, I think you started things off by saying that the National Guard is just now arriving today. So, I mean, presumably you'll start to see maybe more of a presence, more visible in the next couple of days. Any sort of, briefings you're expecting from officials in the coming days as well?
I think at this point, a lot of folks are saying, let's wait and see what happens. And a lot of people don't understand this as well, Vanessa. Since we are Washington, D.C., we see these forces all the time. Not the National Guard. That is a bit different. The last time we saw them was shortly after January 6th. They were on the streets, 2021, they were on the streets for a couple of days. It may have been close to a month at that point, obviously because of the unrest following that attack on the Capitol. Then before that, you had the protests following George Floyd, those protests. So you had the National Guard. Their presence was felt in the city. They were primarily around the Capitol. But in this case, we don't know where the National Guard is going to be stationed. And what that looks like, it may be, again, jarring just because there is no crisis here. Nothing is happening. So do you have the National Guard just stationed up in a random neighborhood? The optics don't look good. But in terms of how effective they are and what they can do, that is still unclear. We've seen hundreds of federal agents out in the streets. They've made a number of arrests, but those have been similar to what the D.C. Police Department will make on any given day. So we're not seeing much of a change right now, but a lot of folks are just waiting to see how this plays out.
And as far as we know, it's 30 days. I guess that's the latest that I had seen. And after that 30-day period, there would be more permissions, I guess, that need to be done to extend that stay.
Yeah, and you need a joint resolution of Congress to get that extended beyond 30 days. That is highly unlikely. No one believes that will happen. But again, you're talking about a president who has defied the laws plenty of times. So we're not sure how that's going to play out, if this would just, fall out eventually, without making a mark or making much of an impact here. But the expectation is that things will go along as normal. You will have the federal presence here in D.C. Helping to lower crime. The National Guard will be stationed as well. But outside of that, I don't think anyone is expecting much more than what we're seeing in the next couple of days.
All right. Lorenzo Hall, we really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us here on Live Impact News, giving us not only the very latest, but also, some local insight. Because, I think a lot of folks don't know some of the nuances of D.C., and maybe we all learned something.
No, you bet.
All right.
No, thank you for having me on. I think what you all are doing, just to piggyback off of that, people don't understand what life is like in D.C., so you hear from the president, and folks may not travel here, and you just take his word for it and assume the worst because he does have this megaphone, he does have this national platform. So what I think you're going to see in the coming days, back to your last question really quickly, Vanessa, you're going to see more D.C. local leaders taking to the national airwaves to sort of paint a more accurate picture of D.C.
Well, we certainly will be covering all that is to come here with the story. We thank you again. Take care, Lorenzo.
You bet.
All right.
Vanessa, thank you.